It fits. It fits the situation. So the way we were talking about this, actually none of this is planned, in the sense that it just happens to be that what we're going to talk about dovetails really nicely into each other. Like, you wanted to start with sort of like the house era, and I'm talking about the pre-house era and sort of what the leading up to that point, and sort of how everything is in a continuum, right? Like the idea of, okay, we're going to get our finest on and go out, obviously is not a new idea, and it's something that is really embedded in the culture of Black Chicago in a lot of different ways. So I want to kind of make this a little bit muddier, because I think immediately you think about club culture, but I'm thinking about the fashion that was happening at churches, right? I'm thinking about fashions that were happening at sock hops at schools. I'm thinking about basement rumpus rooms. Thank you. I'm thinking about, all sorts of spaces where, like there was style. I'm thinking about, I even brought these with me because I'm that person. I brought programs from Ebony Fashion Fairs in the 60s and 70s, and looking at the way the clothes were curated in a very Black way.
Which, shameless plug, if you guys want to actually dig further into the Ebony Fashion Fair, there is an exhibit right now
1968.
at the Arts Bank, Stony Island Arts Bank, with some of the actual clothing on mannequins and stuff there. We just launched it yesterday.
1969.
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually have one dress from the Ebony Fashion Fair in my closet that when my family gave it to me, I was like, you see me. You know my heart and soul. So, yeah, thinking about that. Thinking about looking through old Ebony magazines and thinking about the way in which Eunice curated those items of clothing are actually super specific, because it wouldn't have looked like that in Vogue. That sense of color, texture, the way in which we dress is an expression that is uniquely ours. Thinking about that. Let's see. I wanted to play some records to sort of set the scene. One thing that you were talking about earlier, Duane, and you were like, I hope you brought this record. This is very interesting. So most folks here have heard of the bus stop, right? Now, if you go to the Wikipedia page, it says that the bus stop was born in New York, which is not true. And I love to say that it is not true because I have this recording right here that predates any version of it. Now, the original song, of course, that it's sampling is Do It Any Way You Wanna, right? So that predates that. But this is a version that was a reiteration of that song by Max Simmons and Jimmy Mitchell, 43rd Street Bus Stop. Which is, I want to play that real quickly and think about that as the bus stop being a social dance, as being a dance that people did together, right? For years, long before even the 80s version that really like took off. Like this is the predecessor. So I want to play that real quick. I think 1975? Yeah. 1975. It's not dated, but based on the,
but just as long as you know, before Charlie Green and the bus stop.
This is well before that. This is deep.
I want everybody here to hit the floor. I got a brand new dance. I want you to know how it goes. Come on now. Everybody, don't miss the bus. We're going to do the 43rd Street bus stop. Come on now. Come on now. Hit me. You're looking good. You got a good, strong line. Watch me. Come on. You take 4 steps up, and you take 4 steps back.
4 steps to the right, then bring it on back. You're doing the 43rd Street bus stop. So come on, y'all. Let's do the bus stop right now. I'm gonna blow Georgia while I do the bus stop right now. Woo!
So one interesting thing about this record is I was talking in an earlier session about the role of smaller labels in Chicago. This was Max Simmons' own label, so he put the money up to put this record out. And Max Simmons, we're not going to talk about how he made his money, but he made some interesting investments in, right, there you go, the Chicago way, the good old Chicago way. But anyway, he put money into his own recording career and the career of others, and he recorded some really interesting blues, soul, fusion-y type records. And he does a good version. Have you heard the blues Skin Tight?
Yes.
Come on now.
It's crazy to think about it, though, too, because anybody ever seen, like, the movie Dreamgirls, anything like that, when they demonstrated how something that came out, like, you would have never known about this record. No. Had we not,
if
talked
it didn't
about
exist.
it.
Yeah. If it was
how these smaller labels, like, the world believes that Charlie Green, it's the whole thing, but all the while these are smaller labels that someone discovered, and there was only 500 of these somewhere. Right. And some big entity takes it over, and this stuff is just, and it's been a lot of that throughout the history, including into the house game.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it's one of these situations where why I collect records specifically is because they tell these really interesting stories about how people evolve, like how their career evolved and who they were with and what they did and the intersections. So part of the reason why I wanted to messy it up and talk about, fashion at the church and fashion at the sock hop and all these other spaces is because it wasn't that separated, right? Like people were mixing in ways. So I want to play this record to illustrate that fact. So this is really interesting. The first recording where Donny Hathaway was in his own voice was a record with June Conquest on Curtom Records called Thank You. And he sings, and it's a beautiful record. But right around that time, he recorded this record with Albertina Walker and the Caravans, which is Mama Said Thank You, which is that same record, but it's produced by Albertina Walker on a really super tiny label that she that she put out herself. And so if this didn't exist, you wouldn't know that Donny Hathaway was doing gospel records in Chicago, right? Before he had his solo career. So I just want to play this real quick so you can kind of hear his work. And he's playing piano on this as well. Like I said, I'm saying all that. I'm trying not to go off topic, but I'm saying all that because I think what I've noticed with a lot of these recordings is there's a really interesting crossover between the different genres and the different spaces and places. And then also thinking about the role of the club in the recording industry. So like where the club was the proving ground for a lot of folks. So like in the case of the Impressions, when Curtis Mayfield decided he wanted to be by himself, and he found a replacement in Leroy Hudson, and Leroy Hudson decided that he didn't want to be in the Impressions anymore, they found their replacement playing at the High Chaparral. And he was singing in a group called the Soul Enchanters. His name is Reggie Torian, who's not with us anymore. But he was the guy who was brought in to sing all those beautiful falsetto impressions records. And talking to him about the role of Clarence Ludd, and thinking about who recently passed away, and about the role of these clubs in exposing people. And even Clarence Ludd had a small label. They put out like 2 or 3 records in like 1975. So I mean, I think thinking about that recording industry, and thinking about the style. So I brought a couple of photos because I wasn't able to scan it for a couple of different reasons. But like, this is by Wilbur Holmes. Wilbur Holmes was a guy who did freelance photography for Jet magazine. If someone knows what club this is, please tell me. But I think the fashion on here is pretty remarkable. Can we get can you walk around with this? Because you would be my best friend if you could. So that's from his collection. He's no longer with us, but Wilbur P. Holmes, he did a lot of photography on the West Side mainly. So, and he took pictures of people in clubs. So I have a number of those sorts of photos. Some of them are not appropriate for a family affair, but you know what I'm saying. Just thinking about that, right?
So thinking about when you brought up Donny Hathaway in the club scene, coming back to Chicago after Curtis Mayfield brought him back home from Howard University on the club scene, he met some guys, and they recorded this song that I want to play. It's a group called the Salty Peppers.
Yeah.
Met in the club scene, and the Salty Peppers after Donny Hathaway would end up being Earth, Wind & Fire.
Right. Yeah. It was folks, a combination of the Pharaohs and some other folks together. And that's interesting. That was also on a very tiny label called TEC originally, and I think it got picked up by Capitol, but it was a very, very small label, very small recording that was much more popular in the clubs than it was as a record. Thinking about that level of collaboration in the spaces, in addition to the way that, the styles were coming together in the era.
And one reason why I was so hell-bent on talking about the spaces and the camaraderie and the community and the things that would happen is because a lot of times, and as it relates to the house scene, the story is always told from a standpoint of Robert Williams, Frankie Knuckles coming to Chicago, to a culturalist city, if you will, with not much of a scene happening and creating some big bang forgetting that we had these moments like, all the various lounges and clubs and you had the Afro Arts Theater that gave you Earth, Wind, and Fire, that gave you Shaka Khan, that,
Right.
you know what I mean, this whole thing that birthed,
Right.
Chicago was very rich in our movement. So
these are also interesting. In the back of both these albums, they're talking about two very specific spaces. So this is Junior Wells with You're Tough Enough, which was arranged actually by Charles Stepney, who wound up working with Earth, Wind, and Fire. And they're talking about Pepper's Lounge on here, which is sort of interesting. And I can read this real quickly. Talk about somebody being tough enough. One night in Pepper's Lounge, a little night spot on Chicago's South Side, Junior Wells was introduced as the little giant of the blues. It was around midnight, and the chatter that had been incessant for about 3 hours ceased. In cool dignity, the lithe black cat walked to the stage, and in a voice you'd like to perfect if you were a stick-up man, said, "I'm gonna sing them damn blues, and you better dig it." So that's written by Dave Lorenz of Ebony Magazine. So this is from Mercury Blue Rock subsidiary, this is like a completely Chicago affair on this album. And You're Tough Enough, if you don't know, and Up in Here, which is also promoted on here, were both real big hits, especially here in Chicago, right? Like jukebox hits, and people really enjoyed those records. And this other album that I brought is to give you just a different feel. This is the Vernel Fournier Trio, who performed a lot at the Nation. They have a club, right? So they were like they played there a lot, as well as Mr. Kelly's and Lurlene's Jazz Lounge. I'm just reading the back of this album. The Salam Restaurant is where they played a lot. And another interesting thing about this album, the photos are by Khalila Ali, who was Muhammad Ali's ex-wife. That's also interesting. After they divorced, she had a career as a photographer. So there you go with that. I don't know. It's some of these back of these albums are fascinating because they talk about so much. This was on a very tiny label out of South Shore called Brad's Records, distributed by Music Bag Record Distributors. Yeah, Music Bag. Yes. And anyway, here you go. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. They're both very good records. And I guess since I'm holding these records, right, and there's a turntable, in case you haven't heard these, I'm going to real quickly play just a little bit of You're Tough Enough because I think it's a great record. Real quick. And then a little bit of Vernel Fournier. That's why I was letting it play as long as I did. Like, I just really like that song live. Also, I want to make sure to mention Jack Daniels, who produced this record, who also produced a lot of really amazing blues soul records, and was part of the consortium of folks who was behind a label that I really love that was called Four Brothers, that was out of Barney's record shop on the west side of Chicago. I want to make sure to represent that as well. And also recorded in the club here in Chicago on the South Side. So I think when we negate the role of the club in sort of the recorded history of Chicago music, I think we're doing a serious disservice in pre-house. Because I think house, it's clear that the club scene is super embedded in the culture. But when you talk about the blues and jazz and soul, which a lot of my friends who were musicians back then called the music as a one general term, right? I don't know that the spaces are talked about as much in places like the Burning Spear and the High Chaparral and Mr. Kelly's, and all these other spaces also are important parts of this conversation, but also somebody's rumpus room, right? Also some of these basement spaces. And also the role of, we think about a lot of house producers as being independent artists. Sometimes they had labels, sometimes they were creating their own thing. But there was precedence for that from other genres of music before that. I think one of the most successful in terms of just creating a space for songwriters was Jerry Butler with his workshop. There was a lot of really beautiful young talent that came out of that. And it's interesting with that, the reason why it happened in the first place was he was partnered with Gamble and Huff by Mercury Records here in Chicago, had some hits like Never Gonna Give You Up, and then they decided to leave to do their own thing, and his contract didn't allow that, and he no longer had songwriters. So he decided to build a workshop with young people like Terry Collier at the time, Gray and Hanks, which wound up having some popular hits written by LTD, or written for LTD, like Every Time I Turn Around, Back in Love Again, and their own records, which did okay. Dancing is the big one. Correct, on RCA. But in general, I don't know that we talk about that very much. But one story I want to talk about real briefly is before he passed away, Otis Clay, I interviewed him at length. And one thing I talked to him about was he was recording on a number of labels, including but not limited to Wonderful and High and Cotillion and all these other labels, but he wasn't really breaking out, and he felt like he was, this is a quote, done dirty by various folks in the industry, and he decided to do his own thing. He set up an office on Record Row here in Chicago, and everybody, he as he tells the story, everyone was coming around looking at him, trying to figure out what he was doing, and what he wound up doing was taking a piece of his own self-determination and putting out a record. And I'm thinking about this because I have a picture of him in a club back in the day, smiling with a pretty lady. And this photo is interesting because he's wearing a shirt that says Otis Clay Japan Tour, which he was very big in Japan, by the way. He liked to say that because he thought it was funny, because there's that saying, big in Japan. Anyway, I wanted to play this record I played for him, which is interesting because it's from 1980. So Echo was still a going concern at that point, and the address was his home at 4800 Chicago Beach Drive. And it's interesting because it's arranged and conducted by Bill McFarland of the horn section. And the rhythm is by Benjamin Wright before he really left for real Chicago and wound up working with everybody from Michael Jackson. I mean, everybody. Ben Wright, super popular arranger cat. But anyway, I want to play this particular record because I think it's absolutely gorgeous. And it talks about some of the things, the quality of recordings that he was putting out on a tiny, tiny label that he was distributing himself.
Better check it out. Don't play the fool card. Using your head, forgetting about your heart. Better check it out before you walk out the door, baby. There's gonna be problems no matter where you go. We knew love was a gamble, baby, and we both knew it from the start. Oh, I know. We were playing for the highest stakes in life. We were gambling, yes we were, with our heart. Don't throw your head in, we died a good thing. We got to see it through, see it through, see it through, see it through. We got to see it through.
So the point, I just want to reiterate that one of the beautiful things about these spaces, many of which were Black owned, and these labels, a lot of the smaller ones were also Black owned, is that this idea of self-determination. Like, I'm going to record this record on my terms, the way that I want to do it. I'm going to dress the way I want to present myself to the world, right? This is how I can express my culture in a safe space. Yeah? So, yeah, I mean, it's pretty interesting. I mean, there's other records in here that I think are also interesting. Like, this one's interesting. This was a pretty big hit, gospel-wise. On a tiny, tiny label, Sounds of Soul Records, arranged and produced by Marvin Yancey, which folks might remember from Chuck Jackson, and Marvin Yancey wound up obviously helping Natalie Cole blow up, as well as Peebo Bryson and some other folks here in Chicago. And this is actually Reverend Stanley Keeble and the Voices of Triumph before that, right? Before all that happened, with a really great gospel recording. I'm actually super interested in that, in gospel that's produced by people that purportedly were doing like devil's music. Like, that's kind of interesting to me. And it's much more common than you'd be led to believe.
Gospel was
correct.
You know, you can't separate soul and gospel and blues. It's all
the music.
Yeah,
it's all coming from that same heart. Absolutely. So the one last thing I want to play, it's not recorded in Chicago, but it's Chicago inside and out. And a lot of folks are probably familiar with this record. But I think for everything Lou Rawls wasn't, what he was really good at setting a scene. So I'm going to play this record because he is going to basically, I think this is the right one. I hope this is the right. Well, actually, you can't go wrong with the Lou Rawls monologue. I don't know if you, right? You know what I'm saying? So I I think it's this one. This is the one. Even though he was quick to leave Chicago and call it his ex-hometown, he kept a lot of it in his soul, and the way in which he spoke was very Chicago.
It's up just a little bit for you here. Here's a song that's about a young man that is widely known throughout the world, especially in my ex-hometown where I used to live. See, this young man, very popular young man, and he was standing on a very well-known corner on the south side of my hometown, Chicago. This young man was standing on the corner of 47th and South Parkway, northeast corner. Now there stands a building that houses the Walgreens drugstore, a few other little miscellaneous shops here and there, as a commercial. And every Friday evening, as the people would pass there, they couldn't help but notice this young man. Every Friday, around 4:30, this young man would be seen standing on the corner of 47th and South Parkway, in front of Walgreens. The young man was standing there because his girlfriend worked at Walgreens. And as you all know, Friday the eagle flies. This young man was standing there, and as the people passed him, as always, they couldn't help but notice him because he was wearing the very popular silk mohair wool worsted, continental to the bone, $250 hustler suit, fresh out the pawn shop. He would also be wearing a pair of highly shined alligator hustler shoes with a very popular white-on-white tab collar shirt, very thin silk hustler's necktie tied around his neck, very large artificial diamond stick pin in place. Now, if they noticed even closer to this young man, they couldn't help but notice around the sides of his hat that he was heavily conked to the bone. He was quite patent leatherish about the head. They call it the hustler's hairdo, a process. Many pleats, a lot of creases, and all that greasy kid stuff. Sitting pressed upon this very lightly so as not to mess up his hairdo was his very stingy-brimmed hustler's hat. His hustler's shades on, cigarette in hand, very broad smile on his face. As you looked around to see what this young man was staring at so hard and why he was so elated at what he saw, you couldn't help but notice his automobile parked at the curb. His automobile, white on white in white. The hustlers call them hogs. The trade name is Cadillac. That's a hustler short long the finance company can't find out where he keeps it parked at night. All of a sudden, this young man noticed people passing him or glancing over their shoulders as they walked down the street. There was some great commotion coming down the street behind him. So he thought he would take a peek and see for himself what all this commotion was. This is what he saw when he looked down the street. With pin curlers and rollers in her hair, head rag tied very tight, very large braids on her left hand, big butcher knife in her right hand, housecoat house shoes, his wife. And she was stepping fast, coming after him, calling him all sorts of dirty names and other things that I can't mention up here. They'll close the place. He made a break for his automobile before getting in the car and get the motor started. She was there, cut up the top, kicking dents in the door. You jive, Maryland farmer, out here jiving around, the rent ain't paid, the baby's hungry, need shoes, and you had to call yourself pimping and hustling and carrying on, and all them other good things. He jumped out the car and threw the keys over to her and said, baby, listen, you can have this car and anything else you want, just don't cut my new suit. I just got out the pawn shop and I got to have my front so I can keep on making my game. As he turned to walk away, the young man bowed his head slightly. He lifted his stingy brim from his patent leather do and shook it lightly. He wouldn't shake it too hard, you see, because when you wear a process, you have to go to the barber shop every day and get a comb out, and that costs $2. And he hadn't got his money from the lady yet. He began to mumble something as he walked down the street. And as you listened closer, you heard the young man saying these words. You could tell he was really troubled. He was saying these words in this manner. He was saying,
See how he did that there?
in a world of trouble, I don't know what to do. I'm supposed to be one woman's man. I am in love with you. What is my treasure?
So that's actually a song by Oscar Brown Jr., also from Chicago, that he's singing
They are both
in that. And I also wanted to mention that because he does an excellent job of, this is my Zora Neale Hurston coming out, of ethnography in terms of the fashion of that particular moment that he's trying to capture. I think he does that super well. Yeah, and the rhythm of his voice, right? Like, that was hot. But I'm still upset with that ex-hometown crack. Like, I don't know how I feel about that in my spirit. But it's true. I'm not gonna lie. There was one other thing I wanted to show. I don't know what our timetable is. Well, a couple of things. Well, let's go with that. This is a copy. The original is housed elsewhere. But this is from a fashion show that happened at Lati's Hairstyles on 79th Street, which was a hair place. I wanted to show folks pictures of this. If you want to see what this type of suit that he's talking about looks like, this is from about 1966. This was an event that was had welcome remarks by McKee Fitzhugh, who was a radio personality, music by the Jaguars and J.J. Johnson, and records and commentary by the Terrible T, disc jockey, dancing by the Go-Go Girls. I mean, there was a whole bunch of folks. Presentation of a trophy by the makers of Ultra Sheen. Yeah. So let me show you this picture of the Lati Hairstyle staff, including Moonman, Gorgeous George, Finessing Chet, and Mo Mike.
And that's the kind of situation it could cost somebody's life. Oh, but I'm gonna bear it just as long as I can. No, I don't want to share it with a low other man. Oh, Lord, and my future is in a fog, and they call me a dirty dog because I'm a living double in a world. They got me peeping and hiding, slipping and sliding, ducking and dodging, running down alleys, hiding in doorways, behind paper stands and streetcars and L tracks and buses and down in manholes anywhere else I can find out 'cause I'm scared to death. 'Cause I'm in a great big world. Fellas, don't y'all feel bad? But we're not the only ones living in trouble. Double. The ladies are living double. Some of them living triple. Some of them living quadruplets. Some of them living quintetted and octetted. But we all got our great big world. We're living in a world of trouble. Yeah. Oh.
Preaching to the choir, right? But I think for me, one of the great things about these items is that they document for all time how vibrant and wonderful, just right here in Chicago alone, is and has been.
So talking about that, the one thing that I wanted to get into, we're talking in this time, is the marginalized LGBT community. Who wasn't in some of these spaces, and the spaces that were not available to them, and that's what sparked what became the house community. With legends here like Craig Cannon. Hi, Craig. He's trying to be all shy right now. You got to speak in a little while, so. But yeah, so you had the popular clubs here at the time, and we're talking into the 70s, the bistro and all these spaces that had their black quota. Who were, if they allow blacks in, it was like 2, 3 in max. So people again like Craig Cannon, who I'm going to talk about a lot, had to create their own parties in South Shore neighborhoods and homes and things of that nature, because they, again, we want to talk about safe spaces. And I'm sorry, I'm drawing a complete. A song I want to play, I think a lot of people in this room are familiar with, but when I listen to it again from this lens now and thinking about that this song was recorded in 1977, it hits me now more how powerful it was. And it wasn't created in Chicago, but it was definitely something that we love to death. So I'm going to play it, and I think you guys would know what it is. G-A-I-E-E by an artist by the name of Valentino. But just to think about when everybody now thinks that, in the past few years you've heard this, gay agenda and things as if all of a sudden people, the LGBT community having rights and having visibility and the fight of it is a new thing. To have someone in 1975 and 1977 recording a record, basically, declaring their sexuality. And then the fact that it was also, that guy was a Reverend Carl Bain. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about the gospel, there's no way to really...
I mean, you could even talk, I have some of Keith Barrow's record collection, like his records, and he passed away in the early 80s, one of the first AIDS-related deaths from the Chicago music community. And Reverend Willie Barrow, who was his mother and also a great activist, kept his records in a box from the time that he died all the way until she died. And so I got those records that way. Thinking about how she fought for LGBT rights for the rest of her life in honor of her son, and thinking about those recordings that he recorded for many years is really interesting also to me. And he came from the gospel scene here in Chicago, and people tell some really funny stories about him. But thinking about that there shouldn't be this line, because we're all God's creatures, right? Like, no matter what your opinion is, it's not about you. It's about the person's right to be and to thrive in this world.
Well, this era was, some people disagree because this era was the era, yeah, still do, that, the LGBT community started to express themselves more, outly. And, disco was a catalyst. And, of course, the infamous disco demolition happened right here in Chicago. And it was a direct backlash towards black and brown and LGBT
Correct.
people. Yeah. There's been a lot of times where people will talk about, house as a disco demolition, like the phoenix that rose from the ashes. I disagree. Mainly because I'm not giving any kind of credit to Steve Dahl at all. Any kind of credence to what he did. And on top of that, I don't believe that what that disco demolition did, what it did, obviously it affected the charts. But I don't think it affected what Craig Cannon was doing or what Kirk Townsend was doing or what Robert Williams was doing. I don't think it affected them in any kind of way. Or if anything, they strengthened a bit, but I don't think it had anything to do. But it's funny because there's another song I want to play that there's a very popular song, but when I listen to it again, it's funny how you hear things when you were young and you just loved it as a song, but when you actually listen to it lyrically, and you talk about the times, this song mimic, to me, some of the lyrics is kind of what the public thought of the times and what was going on and the reason why they felt so threatened by the disco movement and why they sought to kill it. For the longest, I heard that song, but I heard another version because I never knew that version was actually edited. So the version I heard, where it's always said, "Let's move somewhere far away, where only upper class people stay," not knowing that they edited because the original words was a place where there's no blacks, no Jews, and no gays. And that pretty much was. Say it again. Machine. No, that's not white people. But the narrative they're talking about in the story, it was them trying to move to a better place to get away from the riffraff of blacks, Jews, gays, or whatever. And that pretty much was the nature. I mean, they were threatened. They felt threatened that this culture, this disco culture that was being championed by black and brown people, I mean, it was all over the charts. It was, right. You know what I'm saying? That it was changing and threatening their way of life. I mean, it was basically the Trump supporters. We're watching this all over again. Okay, I was talking too fast. I'm sorry, y'all. But so
it suddenly got sad. The energy just went down slightly.
Sorry, did I do that to y'all? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Sad.
So yeah, but it just made me think about that, especially with that happening right here in Chicago, of all places that happened here on the day that Minnie Riperton died.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Yep. Very day that Minnie Riperton died. And so with that, I want to go more into There's some stuff I'm not going to talk about because you guys are going to go stay for the last panel, correct? And we have some great people who I'm not going to tell their history because they're here to tell it themselves. But I want to talk about Herb Kent, whom everybody is known as the Dusty Man, Steppers. But a lot of people don't talk about his contribution to house culture and his infamous Punk Out radio show, and it being the way that us as black people start listening to punk rock and all sorts of things. So just want to play a couple songs that wouldn't have made it into the house culture had not been for Herb Kent.
what's interesting about that record? It's Talking Heads, but it was recorded in Jamaica. Like, that's pretty interesting, right? I feel like that's fascinating. Compass Point, like that whole scene, pretty interesting.
Yeah. But it was definitely Herb Kent that introduced us to Talking Heads, the Police, you know. And then it was that led to my generation traveling up north. It was interesting from a geography standpoint how house music traveled and how we traveled in search of it, to foreign spaces, to hidden spaces, to abandoned spaces, to you know, everywhere that you see is gentrified now. We were there first. You know.
Yeah, and then talking about that, like just the role of the spaces in the recordings and the way people listen to the music is really dictated by the way that they were played in the spaces, right? Like thinking about that, like I remember I got some 45s from this guy whose mother had owned a club it closed in 1978, and the box was sealed up and gross and really. But anyway, he opened up the box, and the records that were in there, the way that they play together is so interesting to me. And it was a combination of blues and jazz and soul, but it was like just it was such a capsule of time.
But that's what with house, and the reason why I brought that up is because now, for some reason, globally, house is thought of as this one idea, this one 4/4 drum, this one thing. But in-house culture that's going to be furthest from the truth, because all of that we play it pulls from so many areas. I mean, again, Scat Brothers was a rock group. You know, y'all remember Black Betty? Yeah. You know, that was a rock group, right? You know, Yellow was from Germany, I believe. You know, and it just pulled from so many things, and that's the thing that actually now I think as a DJ that I find has kind of gotten lost in translation in terms of curating. Is how those records were played together. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those crossover records, like Laid Back. Like, there was just, like, a lot of the stuff that, their actual source is one story, and the way that they were actually implemented in the world is a different
But then
story.
our fashion, I mean, everything. I mean, our fashion at that point, we went from the preppy era where we were wearing Zodiacs and Willie wear, and you know that whole thing, and that was around the time that Herb Kent's Punk Out Hour was really popular. And as we got more into start gravitating where we're now incorporating grunge, you know, we're going to Medusas and we're going to all these other spaces. So it's like the space and the movement dictated a lot of different things in terms of the things that we pulled and grabbed and created.
It's interesting. I'm thinking about, there's this documentary from maybe 1984 or something like that. And it's like a Danish documentary. Somebody in Europe did a documentary about hip hop. And it's about Big Beat in the Street or something like that. And it was shot in New York. And there's this one kid that they interview, black kid from Chicago, right? And he's wearing his little polo and his jeans and his little chain. And he's talking about, well, you know, where I'm from, house is our hip hop, right? And when he said that, I was like, yo, because the first time I saw this documentary, my head was not there. But then I thought about it, like all the same source materials, all the same like sorts of spaces and places, same people in the basements making the beats. Like, I mean, there was a lot of there's so much similarity.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to realize when hip hop's birthday is August 9th, 1973, right? And there wasn't much of a culture here, but in New York, you know, that's what they did. And who had to play their records? The discos. It wasn't, you know what I'm saying? So it's birthed from the same places. Right. But in Chicago, when we talk about hip hop, as it relates to house, there was a huge divide at some point, where some people, I remember even actually, Aisha from Honey Pot was talking to me about how, you know, when she came to Chicago, how she was made to choose if she was going to be a house duck or a bee girl. Not realizing that we're cut from the same cloth.
Right.
Later, Lady Soul, who I met at Medusa's, again, I'm not going to tell a story. She's here to tell a story next, but the similarities in hip hop
from their birth, but what it turned into was something a lot more nefarious in terms of the separation.
Yeah, because it became this whole thing. It wasn't just house versus hip hop. It was kind of a sleep versus woke kind of thing, too. This whole dynamic. So, that's what, and then with that became, the hypermasculinity and things of that nature. And I want to get into talking about, even before that, though, that's some of the things that, we talk about the LGBT community, who actually was the breeding ground for house culture, how they made their departure from house culture, because these elements that started to come in, where actually they didn't feel welcome anymore in the spaces that they cultivated. With all of this new, because there's also too, when the house, house is such a varied thing in terms of, you had what they considered the underground, which would have been, the music boxes, things of that nature. Then you had your Hot Mix Fives, and then you had your, Mendel parties, and you had your Bismarck parties that was cultivating a whole new generation of people into house music, but those generations were not being made aware of its origins. Okay, I went too fast. So at some point, and then the LGBT community, we could also, talk about, them being trendsetters and moving to start another trend, if you will. But my biggest, thing is I always want to make sure that it is known where it started. Yeah. So, and let me I want to play some other things. When we talk about youth culture in the 80s, video games were a big deal. How many of us go to the corner store, buy some of the strawberry cookies and spend the rest of our money playing Centipede and, things of that nature. There was a point in time where, like, a lot of people didn't understand this form of music, what we call tracks. And I listened to some of it. I was like, some of this is like video game music. But it was very much so a huge part of my youth culture. That's what those type of songs did. It was never about a message, not about nothing. It was just about freedom, let it go, expression, and dance. And so it's interesting that we didn't. Another thing I never realized with house was that, how when you hear songs like My Prerogative or something 80s, how instantly you want to go into like the Roger Rabbit and things of that nature. Well, certain forms of house had dances that was related to them as well. That has never really been documented. So something like that will make you jack. Something like Annie Mae will make you do the whole, that was the response I wanted. I'm trying to be mindful of time here as well.
How are we doing, by the way? 5 minutes?
Okay. 5 minutes, and I would rather kind of open it up to the floor.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Does anybody have a thought.
I have a zillion
question.
songs, but I'm like 5 minutes. Let me just open it up to the floor. What is that? Of course, I have like war games and all that queued up.